Today in world history marks a defining moment in the global fight against climate change. On this day, the Kyoto Protocol officially entered into force, signaling the first time nations around the world agreed to legally binding targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was more than a treaty. It was a global acknowledgement that the planet was warming, that human activity was accelerating the crisis, and that responsibility could no longer be ignored. The journey to this moment began years earlier, when scientists presented mounting evidence that industrialization, fossil fuel consumption, and deforestation were dramatically increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Glaciers were retreating, extreme weather events were becoming more frequent, and global temperatures were steadily rising. The world was being warned, and leaders could no longer dismiss the science as speculation. In 1997, representatives from nations across the globe gathered in Kyoto, Japan, determined to craft a framework that would move beyond discussion and into action. The result was the Kyoto Protocol, an international agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What made this agreement historic was its legally binding nature. Developed countries committed to specific emission reduction targets, recognizing their historical role in industrial pollution. It was a bold step, and not without controversy. Negotiations were intense. Economic concerns clashed with environmental urgency. Some nations feared the cost of compliance, while others argued that inaction would cost far more in the long run. Debates stretched into the night as diplomats weighed economic growth against planetary survival. Yet eventually, a consensus emerged. Doing nothing was no longer an option. When the Kyoto Protocol finally entered into force, it required ratification by a sufficient number of industrialized nations. That threshold was met, and the agreement became international law. For the first time, countries were not just encouraged, but obligated to reduce emissions. Mechanisms such as emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism, and joint implementation were introduced, allowing nations to collaborate and innovate in meeting their targets. The world watched closely. Supporters hailed it as a breakthrough, a sign that global cooperation was possible even in the face of complex challenges. Critics questioned its scope and effectiveness, pointing out that some major emitters were not bound by the same commitments. Yet regardless of the debate, the Kyoto Protocol represented a shift in global consciousness. Climate change was no longer a distant environmental issue. It was a central political and economic concern. Over time, the agreement influenced energy policies, encouraged investment in renewable technologies, and accelerated conversations about sustainability. Wind farms began appearing across landscapes, solar panels multiplied on rooftops, and governments introduced policies aimed at cleaner energy and greater efficiency. While the protocol did not solve climate change, it laid the groundwork for future agreements, including broader global efforts that followed. Perhaps most importantly, the Kyoto Protocol demonstrated that the international community could unite around a shared environmental goal. It acknowledged that climate change transcends borders. Carbon emissions released in one country affect weather patterns, agriculture, and sea levels worldwide. The atmosphere does not recognize political boundaries. Today, as conversations about climate action continue, the legacy of the Kyoto Protocol remains visible. It marked the beginning of binding global climate commitments and set the stage for deeper cooperation. In the years that followed, it reminded the world that progress often begins with courage, the courage to recognize a problem, the courage to negotiate solutions, and the courage to commit to change. On this day in world history, the Kyoto Protocol entered into force and changed the trajectory of international environmental policy. It was not the end of the climate struggle, but it was the beginning of accountability on a global scale. And in that moment, the world took a collective step toward protecting the planet for future generations. History is not old. History is living inside us. One day, one event, one lesson. Mr. Fidi,